All right. Thank you. It's definitely a different crowd than what I'm used to. Good evening. That's what I'm talking about. You know, I grew up in a black church, so I'm used to this call and response. So this is feeling really good for me. Good evening and welcome to tonight's special conversation with Ezra Klein about abundant housing, something I know all of us care a lot about. My name is Angela Brooks, and I'm president of the American Planning Association and director of the Illinois Office of the Corporation for Supportive Housing. APA is honored to work with YIMBY Action as a sponsor for tonight's program, and we are very grateful for their partnership, hard work, and leadership in the fight for more housing. Tonight's program is particularly important to me. A little less than 2 years ago, I had the honor of becoming the president of APA. And as president, thank you. I paid them for that one. And as president, housing and zoning reform have been our top priority. I've had the chance to travel the country and even the globe examining aspects of the housing crisis, promoting solutions, and working with planners and allies to lead change. Now, let's be honest, those of you in the room. How many of you would have expected a bunch of planners to be in the room with you a couple of years ago? And we are excited to be here, and we are excited to be leading the change that all of you are working on in your communities and to be your partners. Too many Americans are stuck, unable to move to housing that fits their needs and their budgets, unable to access neighborhoods of opportunity, unable to create housing that is diverse, attainable, and equitable. I am aware that for some advocates in this room, you're still dealing with a lot of changes in zoning codes, land use rules, and other regulatory structures, and it's a priority for planners to look at these things too. I want to assure you, it really is, and that is why we're here with you tonight. APA is engaging at the local, state, and federal levels, and in a variety of partnerships to lead the reform conversation. We are committed to working with the advocates and elected officials to provide the professional insights, long-term vision, and expertise needed to craft and implement a reform agenda to increase housing supply. But we face a contradiction in our approach. We plan for what we want, but we regulate for what we don't. We need a realignment where we are using the tools of government not to limit our future, but to lead us to realizing our vision and our collective potential. Among our efforts at APA is the Housing Supply Accelerator and the New Housing Supply Playbook. This effort has aimed to bring points of view across the pipeline of housing supply. Planners, local officials, builders, realtors, and bankers to identify the kinds of innovative, promising practices that can get our communities unstuck and delivering the housing that we need. I hope you will take a moment to check out this work. I believe most of you got flyers when you walked in with the QR code. It really is one of the things I will be most proud of in 3 months at the end of my term that we were able to do. It is a usable document. It really would be a tool for a lot of the work many of you are doing and has some really amazing case studies, some of which probably reflect the work that many of you have been doing. So I'm excited for tonight's discussion, not only because I'm a total fangirl for Ezra Klein, but Ezra has been leading the charge on housing supply, but also the theme of abundance is so important, and frankly, it's an uplifting vision in a moment too often filled with acrimony and polarization. This issue is incredibly bipartisan, maybe more so than any being discussed at this moment in time. In fact, planners from across the country have been on Capitol Hill today to talk with lawmakers about a federal role in helping drive local housing supply solutions. From Capitol Hill to the campaign trail, this issue is everywhere. I believe it has the potential to unite us while also unleashing our economy and our communities. Opportunity must not be a scarce resource to be controlled, hoarded, and over-regulated. Opportunity is an asset to be grown and shared. Our plans and our systems for housing need to reflect these facts. If we want to create greater opportunities for everyone and communities that work for all, we need plans that dare to focus on an abundance of the things that we know we need to thrive. Housing is at the top of that list. Let me close by saying that our work is just beginning, but APA is committed to working with all the advocates, housing leaders, elected officials, and stakeholders to craft and advocate for policies and plans that will make housing a foundation for better communities across the country. I can't wait to hear tonight's conversation, so let me get out of the way. Again, I grew up in a Black church. You know I can be long-winded. So let me now turn the microphone over to our host for tonight's conversation, great leader and great partner in housing reform, YIMBY Action's Managing Director, Jillian Pressman.
Thanks, everyone. So I'm Jillian Pressman. I'm the Managing Director of YIMBY Action and YIMBY Law, and I'm so excited to welcome you to this conversation with Sonja Trauss and Ezra Klein. It's so exciting. So thank you all for being here with us in DC, but we also shout out, I don't know where the camera is, shout out to the people watching virtually. We have, hello, shout out. We have hundreds of people watching virtually. We actually have watch parties in San Francisco, the San Francisco Peninsula, Santa Cruz, Bend, Oregon, and as far away as Hawaii. So aloha, y'all. So let's ground this a little bit in why we are here. Who, and you can raise your hand at home too, who here thinks their rent or mortgage is too damn high? Yes. Who has maybe sacrificed because of the housing shortage? Maybe you didn't take a job, or maybe your commute is too long, or maybe you're living with roommates you really don't want to live with. You've delayed some life decisions. Anyone have that situation? Okay. Who thinks homelessness is appalling and our skyrocketing homelessness needs to end? Yes. Okay. So we are YIMBY Action, and we are a national movement of you all. We are people who are suffering under the housing shortage, and we are fed up with the suffering. And we were actually started by someone about 10 years ago who was so fed up with the suffering that she decided to go to Planning Commission and show up where the housing was being proposed and do something that was crazy at the time, which was instead of saying, no, not in my backyard, she decided to say, yes in my backyard. And that person is Sonja Trauss, and she's here with us today, founder of the YIMBY movement. So Sonja and her ragtag band of activists is now YIMBY Action. We are now a national movement. We're actually in 67 chapters in 27 states, which is very exciting. We have a sister organization, YIMBY Law, which focuses on implementing the law, which is what we're going to talk about a lot tonight. That's a big deal. And we're getting pretty unprecedented national attention. We showed up in the New York Times Mini the other day. I don't know if anyone plays that. I thought that was cool. I knew the answer. We have presidential candidates talking about housing. We have the country's most illustrious and respected journalists writing a book about the housing shortage. That's Ezra. I'm talking about Ezra, if you don't know. And we're getting wins. So here's a smattering. Just in the last year, our chapter, Hawaii, YIMBY, and their partners legalized accessory dwelling units across Hawaii. Right across the river, our Virginia chapters passed single-stair reform to actually make missing middle housing actually feasible. And in Colorado, our Denver and Fort Collins YIMBY and their partners removed housing bans near transit. So round of applause for these incredible wins. We need to see more of them. But here's the thing. When the governor in these states signs these bills into law, it does not mean that your rent goes down. And it does not mean that you can kick out your roommates. And it does not mean that people who are homeless automatically get homes. These laws are great on paper, but they need to actually be turned into real housing. And that is what we're here to discuss today, the implementation. So what does it take to get good policy to actually be implemented? What does it take to navigate the somewhat messy process? And how do we as a YIMBY movement go from getting wins to getting homes, which is what we need? So we'll discuss a lot of that today. I'm excited for you all to dig in. If you are on the YIMBY Slack, we have a little thread going, so ask your questions in the Slack. I'll be asking some questions of the panelists. But without further ado, let's turn it over Sonja Trauss and Ezra Klein.
Thanks so much, Jillian. What's the channel in our Slack?
It is YIMBY Events, and there's a thread. It's called Ask Ezra and Sonja.
Yeah.
Ask Ezra and Sonja.
I don't really want people on their phones, but I actually am quite interested, especially as we're talking, as someone who was always in the front row raising their hand. If you're also that person, I really sympathize. So if there's something that you really feel like needs to get said, that's a channel. So yeah, thank you so much for coming here. Thanks for being with us. I have to admit, I'm going to start on a personal note that my parents were baffled by this event. And they kept asking me over and over again, why did Ezra Klein say yes? So they might have meant, that you're famous and I'm like some schlub, just their kid that they know. But I wanted you to tell, in your words, I think it's obvious, but what is the intersection between, YIMBYism and your current, project, life's work?
I like this amazing humble brag, why are the YIMBYs great question. Like, oh, we're just these schlubs. Why are you? But you're here. I'll give you two answers. So one is that I'm a Californian, and my state is sort of fucked. And nobody was doing very much about it. And then my sort of understanding is you began yelling at people at meetings, and now we have all the houses we need.
Done. We're done.
And I'm here to celebrate that
Right.
remarkable victory from attending local planning meetings. You don't see political intellectual movements and activist movements rise as quickly as the YIMBYs did very often. And sort of pair an actual sort of intellectual revolution in how people think about things, which has now reached all the way to Barack Obama and Kamala Harris at the Democratic Convention, and pair that with really, really rapid shifts in the identities of the sort of political identities of liberals, at least in this case, and also legislation passing. It's a remarkable thing. The other reason, and I've learned a tremendous amount from it, and have studied it, and reported on it, and it's part of this upcoming book I'm doing. But I was joking when I said I'm here to celebrate it because I'm actually, one of the reasons I wanted to come was not to sit here and answer questions, but to ask a question and to sort of wrestle with it in a room where you all were, which is, if you had told me how many YIMBY bills Gavin Newsom was going to sign into law over the past 6 years ago, I would have said I'd be able to see that on a chart of housing starts in California. Certainly in San Francisco, where London Breed says she's a YIMBY, where Gavin Newsom is, where Brian Hanlon and everyone are, and yet you can't really. And so I'm actually writing a piece about this and trying to think about it and wrestle with it. There is this divergence between this remarkable intellectual victory of the YIMBY movement and not as much policy success, or at least housing success, actually there's a lot of policy success, that you can point to. And one of the reasons I'm thinking about it is, all right, Kamala Harris is up there. Her very first policy announcement was she's going to build 3 million homes. I noticed there weren't a lot of bullet points under that promise. I read that kind of thing. And sometimes they're not giving you the bullet points because they don't want to, or they're doing things fast. And sometimes you suspect they actually don't know. And in this case, I don't think they know, because nobody's done it. right? This is not like when Barack Obama picked up Mitt Romney's healthcare reform and made some changes to it. They had passed that reform in Massachusetts. It was giving people healthcare. Like, you could just sort of take that, put some new bullet points in it, and pass it. But here, like, everybody agrees, housing supply, and now there's this great question of how. So yeah, I wanted to be here to think about it aloud.
Actually, at 5 of, apparently, one of our friends texted me and said that Harris released more details of the plan.
Yes, there's a big 80-page.
Right, asked me to ask
Yes.
you what you thought about it.
I've been here with you
I know,
during
that's
this
why it's a joke.
80-page release. I don't. The thing I'm actually sort of saying here, though, is
Yeah.
that it doesn't matter what's in the plan. I mean, it does matter. Don't quote me. It doesn't matter what's in plans. It's very counter-brand for me. It is not clear to me that we know how to do this. Because there's a lot of bills that you all told me were going to be a big deal, and we're building a lot of ADUs in California.
Yeah, they're building a lot of ADUs. There have been cities in Minnesota, they apparently were able to avoid price increases. In Austin, they had rent decreases. In Philadelphia recently, there's a glut, right? One of the things that happens is when housing succeeds, so newspapers will report everything as bad news, right? When there's not enough housing and housing prices are too high, the headline is that rents are too high. And then when there's a housing glut, that's what they say, a glut. And a glut sounds bad, right? They're like, investors are freaking out. I mean, in Oakland and in San Francisco on the east side, a number of large buildings have gone into receivership basically because the rents were not what they expected. And that's our victory. You know what I mean? It sounds like it might not register as a good thing because it's reported like, oh no, they're on the verge of bankruptcy. But that's actually what it looks like when you get more housing than investors anticipated.
But would you say in San Francisco they're building enough?
I'll say that rents did go down. I don't know if they're building enough. No, I wouldn't say they're building enough because we have so much pent-up demand for San Francisco. And one of the things, like, San Francisco has been exporting its housing shortage. There have been people leaving San Francisco because housing prices were high since the 80s, which is one of the reasons why nationally people care so much about San Francisco. A lot of times San Franciscans will be like, why is the national press obsessed with us? But because there's tens of thousands of people all over the country who lived there for a few years until they were priced out. So somewhere like that or somewhere like New York, there's a lot of pent-up demand. But there's certainly been victories that have led to price modifications. And this is the opportunity for you guys in the Slack, if anybody wants more examples. But I want to touch on what you were saying as far as a movement that has both an idea and also a strategy. Because that's, to me, when I first noticed you writing about like a liberalism that builds or even abundance, on the one hand, the notion of abundance in the first group that I heard using that word for it was in Austin. The YIMBYs in Austin were talking about abundant housing. Like, that phrase is from them, so I want to give credit. And this notion of abundance has been part of our movement for a long time. And then also our whole theory of change is to show up, right? That's the implementation part, that there's a place that people are making these decisions and we have to show up. So what made you interested in implementation? Because it's something that gets overlooked most of the time, right? Like, smart guys want to be like, oh, well, I'm interested in policy, What personally made you interested in implementation?
Jen Paulka, who some of you may know for work, but she wrote an amazing, I think it's the best book written about how government actually works in the last decade. And she says that, I'll get this phrase a little bit wrong from memory, but she says that prestige in government is inversely related from the distance. Prestige in government is directly related to how far you are from implementation, right? If you're all the way, like, to be the White House strategist, right, or director of the NEC is super prestigious. Like, to be somebody actually on the ground implementing this work, oh, well, you're like a civil servant, and it doesn't work if you don't implement it. I am pissed that government can't deliver on things that I want it to deliver on. I moved back to California. So I grew up in California, I grew up in Irvine. And then I moved to Washington when I was 21. And I moved back to California, that was in 2005. And I moved back to California, first Oakland and then San Francisco in 2018. And I love California. And I spent a lot of time thinking and reporting on why is a state I love not doing better? California's economy, particularly in that period, was booming, like absolutely killing it. And yet we were losing people. We had all these talented politicians, and they're very ambitious. You might have seen a number of them on the news recently. And you would think, right, in this era when there's a huge budget surplus, that like somebody like Gavin Newsom go around the country saying, you vote for me and I will make this whole country like California. That's what Rick Perry was saying when he ran in 2016 or 2012. 2012? When did Rick Perry run? Both? It's been a long time of covering politics for me. My brain is not what it once was. Anyway, you can't do that in California. And you can't do it because people aren't happy with how it's turned out. And when I looked around, what I saw was a consistent inability to build the things people needed. And this is not like some remarkable, like I'm not Columbusing, like there are not enough houses. Matt Iglesias and many other people were on this before me. Abundance, I hate to tell you, even predates the Austin YIMBY faction. It's partially a term from People of Plenty, a David Potter book from 1954, I think it is. Like abundance is an American idea, essential to the American character, goes back a long way. But one of the things that always stuck in my gut in California was actually not housing. And it's sort of one of the things that for me motivated the inquiry. It was, where the hell is high-speed rail? They've been talking about that. They actually got started talking about it in California in the 80s. And I was in Washington covering the Affordable Care Act, well, that too, but the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act under Barack Obama. And for people who remember that was a big stimulus bill during the financial crisis. And that bill had these two sides, like rescue the economy right now, unemployment insurance, that kind of thing, but then build these big definitional pieces of infrastructure for the future. And the three that you heard about a lot back then, the three things that were the headlines were, one, high-speed rail, two, the smart grid, and three, interoperable electronic health records. And here we are in the year of our Lord, 2024, and we have none of them, to my knowledge, right? Nobody I talk to in the decarbonization world is like, don't worry, the grid is smart now. Like, we're done. And so it got me thinking, like, what the hell is happening here? So we could talk about all these pieces. Housing was one big piece of it. I saw the YIMBYs, I saw the work on that. The more I dug into what was happening and what the theories were that made sense in climate, the more you realized it was a breakneck build-out of physical infrastructure we were talking about, a build-out on the scale of nothing we've seen since arguably the highway infrastructure era, maybe before that. And if we didn't get it done, we were not going to hit anywhere near our climate goals, either in America or worldwide. And then just day to day, why can't we build a train? Other places build trains. Like, we should be able to build a train. So you start looking into it, and the problems are different, but they end up being very related.
So one of the parts of implementation, initially we started with implementation, bringing politics, given the existing structure of having neighborhood input, we realized that we needed neighborhood input that was going to be pro-housing, so we did that. Then we discovered there were laws that were actually, supposed to be mandating certain kinds of implementation. We started enforcing them. And I had thought that, and this is actually a long response to what you're saying. This is not a new question, just FYI.
I would like you to talk more, because I'm here to, I know what I think. So from my perspective, it's great if you take this away.
Okay, good. So I have actually always been of the opinion, and I think that this is often true, that lawmakers don't realize they'll pass a law, and they'll think that cities will just do it, or they'll pass a program and they'll think it'll happen because they're lawmakers and they made the law, right? Like, I think they genuinely, some of them are naive, and so they don't put implementation plans or enforcement in there on purpose. But I was listening to actually a New York Times podcast, The Daily, about why are the ceasefire talks falling apart. And in that podcast, the speaker was talking about this notion of constructive ambiguity, which is normally a way that ceasefire resolution, agreements happen, where you'll say, we're going to do this thing that one side wants, but then not put in any implementation or any enforcement. And so then both sides are happy because the side that doesn't want to do it can see that there's no way to actually do it, and the side that wants to do it sees it's in there. And this was like, mind blown. I mean, what I'm saying is that something like high-speed rail or any program that seems like it got passed, if there was ambiguity in how it was going to get rolled out, then what the lawmakers were doing were pushing the politics down to a lower level. That it's in some sense on purpose. They're like delegating again for those fights to happen somewhere else.
I'm going to admit, I don't think that's why the ceasefire talks are falling apart.
Okay, but this was the idea.
Other dynamics
it's just this concept.
Yeah, I'll say two things about this. And I don't know, I will say the experience of really, writing this book, doing this inquiry has sucked. I don't enjoy it. I don't enjoy what it's made me think about people I like. And I'd like to go back to my previous state of ignorance. One thing I think I've come to believe that I didn't believe 10 years ago is that you need good names for things. So you call it a liberalism that builds. But privately to people, I call it a liberalism that cares about details. Mm-hmm. Because I'm a liberal, and my people are liberals who care about policy. And what we do is we fight like hell for the bill to pass. And then it's hope it works out.
Right.
And, I covered that on Obamacare, and certainly at the beginning, it didn't work out. And why didn't it work out? Because our procurement system was garbage, and nobody had paid attention to that. And so that's one. And as a liberal, it's very easy to... Here's how I think I approached a lot of stories about regulation for a period of time in my career. You'd hear about a bad regulation. And you'd think, yeah, definitely some regulations are bad. That's probably an exception. And you wouldn't think about it too hard, right? It wouldn't be a metaphor for other regulations. It'd be yeah, all the corporations, they don't like regulations. I'm sure some of them go a little bit too far. But there's a kind of question of when these things begin pinging on you, do you begin to think maybe there's something systemically wrong? And the flip for me was that maybe when it costs $1.8 million to build a small public restroom in a park in San Francisco that already has plumbing hooked up to it, and when that gets reported on, the Rec and Parks manager says, I don't know what everybody's so upset about. 2 other small public restrooms also cost between $1.6 and $1.8 million. You think, well, maybe actually something's really wrong here. That's one. And then you mentioned the lawsuits. Other countries don't do this, right? They have governments, and they don't run the government through suing it. And in here, like a book that was really influential in my thinking was this book, Public Citizens by Paul Sabin. And in this sort of potted story we tell about post-war liberalism, it's there's the New Deal and World War II, and there's building a lot of stuff and the Great Society, and then here comes Ronald Reagan. And okay, that sort of makes sense. And then you realize, though, that Ronald Reagan actually isn't why you sue the government. I mean, in a way, him and Richard Nixon are. Ronald Reagan, hilariously, is the person who signed the California Environmental Quality Act into law. But people thought that was such a nothing burger. The LA Times didn't devote a single article to that bill when it passed. Nobody thought it meant anything. It wasn't until a couple years later that a bunch of rich people in Mammoth sue the government, saying because the Friends of Mammoth, they were called, because somebody was going to build condos and mixed-use development in Mammoth. And this group sues and says, you can't do this under the California Environmental Quality Act. And it was what? No, like that bill, it's like for the government. Like the government has to do environmental impact reports. And then, so it gets thrown out in the lower court and thrown out on appeal, and the Supreme Court is like, no, no, no. Anything that requires a public permit is a public project. Nader, Rachel Carson, this was all built to sue the government. So there's actually a form of liberalism that emerges. It's all about constraining the government, right? All about making the government, and there are good reasons for that, or at least some good reasons for that. And we can talk about Robert Moses and a lot of genuine, actual environmental abuse, right? There are reasons an anti-growth liberalism emerges. But it's like anything, right? If you're lucky enough to truly succeed politically, right, and to solve the problems of your time, you will inevitably become the problem of the next era, right? Like the job of institutional reform is endlessly renewing, right? It's not that Ralph Nader was wrong or Rachel Carson was wrong. I mean, they're wrong about specific things, but in general, I think they're heroes. But they were too right. And so now you have this government that works really weirdly. Paul Sabin has this great line about this era of liberalism, and he says, it's like the liberals took apart the bicycle of government and never figured out how to put it back together again.
Yeah, I want to reiterate that Nader is a hero. He's definitely my hero as a consumer advocate, and I do think that what we're doing is consumer advocacy. I mean, we're housing consumers, we need more. I do want to talk about CEQA for a second, but I don't know, I really don't think, I don't think the structure is necessarily the problem, I think it's the participants. So, you can have, that's what I was trying to get at with pushing the conflict down to other levels, right? We have, politics, we have people who disagree with each other, and people at quote unquote higher levels of government can appear to pass something where there isn't actually a majority, there isn't actually agreement on it. They can make it appear that there's agreement and appear that it passed by leaving out leaving big questions unanswered. And so that's why, if you're an advocacy group or a funder or somebody who wants to do something, I mean, the mistake is thinking that when it passed at a high level that the conversation was over and that the politics had finished, but the politics are actually ongoing. So the everything bagel liberalism that you talk about where, you're adding on this thing and this thing and this thing, it has to have a child care center or whatever, is kind of it's kind of the same idea of putting a lot of pork in a bill. You know what I mean? It's something that gets the thing passed in a way that, maybe sabotages it, but it, pushes the conflict basically to another level. But yeah, so, I mean, what is, just now, you're like, oh, there's something really wrong. And sometimes in some of your writing, it actually makes it sound like you think that there's a conflict between implementation and either liberalism or democracy. Do you think there's really a conflict there?
I mean, definitely sometimes.
Like an ideological conflict, not just a practical conflict in the way that things are set up.
One of the hard things for me about writing this book about abundance is there's no one lever, there's no one question, there's no one weird trick that will fix the whole thing. I think the place where maybe I diverge with the explanation you're giving is you end up, when you sort of start looking across a bunch of domains, in this what the fuck happened in the 70s question endlessly. So I was just reading on my way down here, I was going to say because I'm a nerd, but actually because I'm writing a book, this Ed Glazer paper. I guess I'm writing a book because I'm a nerd.
Yeah.
This Ed Glazer paper about why construction productivity fell over time in America. And this is sort of follow on to an interesting paper by Austin Goolsbee and Chad Syverson. And basically the point is that manufacturing productivity has quadrupled, quintupled, whatever, from over the last however many decades. And construction productivity has been flat or declining. And Glazer sort of builds on this to look specifically at housing productivity. And he shows something really, I think, interesting, which is one, housing productivity measured by how many units of the thing we're talking about, housing and cars here, a single worker could create. Housing and cars track each other for a long time. I didn't realize that, until something like the 60s. And then something happens, and the 70s happen, and cars continue to become much more productive and housing doesn't. Now, it's not like you can't make housing more productive. You can build prefab, right? We actually have quite a lot we can do. But it tracks a couple things. It tracks regulatory burden. And the other thing that he notes is that the firms that construct homes are incredibly small. And the firms that manufacture things are very large. So most things are manufactured by firms of more than 500 people. Most homes, single-family homes, are manufactured apparently by firms of 0 to 4 people. And the problem appears to be that you can't scale regulatorily, right? And maybe that maybe speaks to your pushing it down. At the same time, though, what was happening in the environmental side that made it so much harder to build big things, and it's currently making it hard to site large wind farms, is not that we pushed it down to the local level. NEPA and like the whole raft of the Endangered Species Act. I mean, these have local instantiations, but like they're not primarily local legislation. They're local versions of them, but that's not what's happening. I think what happens is ideological, right? And it has a lot of different manifestations, but you come out of a long period in American life where we're growing a lot, and there's a lot of cost to that growth, and at a lot of different levels of society, people begin to throw on the brakes. And in order to undo that, you're going to have to work at a lot of different levels all at the same time. But more than that, you're going to have to get people to see things differently, right? The genius to me of the YIMBY movement was always, and I assume this is because it's built into your personality, that it had like this fuck you at its core, right?
Yes.
That it was, from the beginning, it was clear about what it was arguing with, right? Like right there in the acronym is a different way of thinking about the world. And one of the things I've come to believe is much more so than people like give it credit for, a bunch of ways of thinking about the world have taken over in liberalism that just don't work. So I just did an interview with the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, and we were talking about these exact issues. And he started talking about how important it was. I think Pete Buttigieg believes that he's sort of on the side of more infrastructure. Certainly he believes that, but he was talking about how important it is to empower localities. And it's just a way liberals have come to think. And the fact that it's maybe not a good way to think, it's not, I think, conflict ambiguity, as you're putting it. It's actually like an ideological view that the other way would be worse. And I think those are the things that have to get argued with, and they'll sort of make their way into legislation in different ways at different levels. But I do think of this as a pretty thoroughgoing set of kind of ideological and institutional questions.
Yeah, so one of the things, this fits in with one of the specific things about CEQA. One of the ideologies that we want to change or that we need to revisit is status quo bias. So CEQA in particular, you have to do an environmental impact report. And you're going forward, you're thinking, I'm going to build this building or I'm not going to build this building. The way that law is set up and interpreted is it's automatic that you assume that there's no environmental impact if you don't do the thing, which we know is wrong, right? And that is status quo bias that is built right into the process. And this is an example actually of how I think that it might be possible that environmental review could be less of a barrier, but not if you have an environmental review that privileges the status quo, that says if you don't do it, there's no environmental impact, when we know that if it's like dense housing or a windmill, not doing it has an environmental impact. And that's something that we could change, you know what I mean? We can redesign, we can give lower level decision makers different instructions about how they're supposed to be doing these kinds of environmental reviews so that you have to actually evaluate the environmental impact of not doing something, and you can get a better result.
I'm really frustrated with progressivism on permitting reform. And the Biden administration, I will say this. They need to stop hiding behind Joe Manchin's legs, on this. Joe Biden, it frustrates me so much because they care. They say great things. Look at what John Podesta says. Look at what Brian Deese was saying. They passed the Inflation Reduction Act, these once-in-a-generation climate investments. Joe Biden was going to run for re-election on the tagline, finish the job. What is making that job so hard to finish? Well, that it's so hard to build all this clean energy you want to build. What are you going to do about that? Well, Joe Manchin. So Joe Manchin, in order to pass the IRA, demands his permitting sidecar, which is not a great permitting sidecar, but it has some good things in it, in part thanks to Chuck Schumer on transmission reform. But everybody on the left hates Joe Manchin, so it doesn't pass. Now you have the bipartisan Manchin-Barrasso bill. Okay, fine. The left doesn't like it. The Biden administration is not going to go like whole hog on behalf of this sort of, centrist to right permitting bill. Where is the Democratic vision, the climate activist vision of what really good permitting reform looks like that actually speeds things along? I don't want to tell you there's nothing. There was a very modest kind of consensus package that came out of a special committee in the House, right, a clean energy special committee. I read that. I think it's important that they are trying to figure this out, but you could tell that there was not enough consensus for something significantly bold. You can see some proposals by groups like the Roosevelt Institute, but they're like coming to this kicking and screaming. I want to see progressives who keep telling me that we're all going to be annihilated by climate change. I want to see them say this is what we think is going to build wind turbines fast enough to hit the line on the chart that they keep holding up. And the Biden administration has never put out their vision on this. House Democrats have never put out their vision on this. Senate Democrats have never put out their vision on this. Most of the groups relevant here have never put out their vision on this. In housing, there's questions about how do you get the things built, but it's at least clear what people think should be done. We are far into this fight now. Big bills have passed, a lot is trying to be built, and there's not yet an answer on the left, broadly construed, of how they think that building is supposed to go or how they think it's supposed to be accelerated. It should embarrass Democrats. It should embarrass them that Texas is where the clean energy is being built at a breakneck pace. And it should scare them because if you look at what the Texas legislature keeps proposing, they keep proposing bills to make it illegal or make it difficult to build clean energy because clean energy will and is polarizing. But Texas is running way ahead, not just on housing, but on clean energy installation because it's really easy to build there by default. And if that's not good, right, well then why? If Texas is having terrible outcomes in terms of all the wind and solar they're permitting, I'd like to hear about it. This is the stuff that I think is really lagging behind ideologically for liberals.
Yes, the progressive world is kind of includes Democrats. It's an overlap, right? But I actually think your audience for this, the people who should be the most embarrassed are Sierra Club. So, in Cape May, there was a proposal, for windmills off the coast. It was all permitted at the federal level, right? They got everything that, some YIMBYs say we want. No local control. There was nothing for the locals to do at all, except for the actual, building departments to look at the plans to do trenching and stuff and say, okay. And yet, there were locals who were pissed, right? It was going to ruin their view. They apparently did get funding from, oil companies, but the locals were real people. They weren't crisis actors. These were real people who hated it. And there was no organizing on the other side. There absolutely does exist a Sierra Club chapter in that area. We didn't see them, I'm often proposing in our meetings that YIMBY Action should make another organization the same size just to do clean energy activism because I see the same problem. And that's actually an example of how there was permitting reform. You know what I mean? There wasn't a formal mechanism for locals to screw that up, but they did manage to cancel those for at least, the original company that was going to do them quit the project. Apparently there's another company that's come in, so maybe they'll still get built. They could have been done now, There was no formal process, but local opposition, if it's not countered by local promotion, will stop something because at the end of the day, it's a human being that either signs that thing or doesn't, and they can gob it up.
This is what I'm saying. That I think the reason I'm critical of the Biden administration on this, and they've been amazing on clean energy in a million different ways, is that this splits their coalition to go as far as they want to go. as far as I think they know they need to go on this, would be coalitionally dangerous for a Democratic administration, right? Maybe if Republicans, and particularly if like the Republicans of 30 years ago controlled the House and the Senate, they would do some big deal on that. But that's why they've been like letting Joe Manchin take the lead, because Joe Manchin will take the heat. But the problem with letting Joe Manchin take the lead is Joe Manchin's actual ideas about this are, some of them are fine, some of them are not. But it's definitely not like a deep-seated, serious take on climate, like leading the way on this. And this is, this is always a tough thing. As you were saying, I'm being intentionally imprecise in my language when I talk about like the left and the Democrats, because I care about what this like large coalition does. But what has been important about the YIMBYs, and it's why I bring up the sort of conflictual nature at its charismatic heart, is that there's like a willingness to be in a coalitional fight, right? And yes, you do eventually need friends, but you can't change minds if you're not willing to call things out. And at least at the national level, I think that the modern Democratic Party is so highly coalitional that it has a lot of trouble with this kind of internal fighting. When it can get agreement, it can move forward in really, I think, actually sometimes very impressive ways. The fact that something like the IRA passed is very impressive. But then when you get to the part where there's not agreement, things begin to, actually not fall apart, just not happen.
That's actually, that's nice, actually. That's very nice to hear. I'm enjoying that for a moment. So right before you were talking, I was like, oh man, this has become kind of a bummer. But that actually made me feel like this is less of a bummer. But I do want to say that, given everything we have now, right, people should be joining their local Sierra Club chapter and running for officer, to be officers in it. YIMBYs have been taking over those chapters, and it's for the good. This is a group that needs to get it together on housing and climate, and there are things that you can do literally like right now, getting involved in these existing organizations. But yeah, I think that's interesting because the sort of Democratic coalition, right? They have to struggle so hard to keep so many different groups together. So I guess we can talk about what's happening at the federal level because we've been talking about it in any case. I mean, Harris has great housing rhetoric. Everybody's quite excited about it. There's like, how does it get implemented as far as what policy is, and then if those policies pass, will they do anything? But what would you like to see the federal government do on housing, and what do you think is actually possible?
I think there, frankly, you, among other people, are more qualified in the room to write the agenda than I am. I will say that I think I know what they are going to do if they could pass the thing that they think they can pass, which is the thing that I keep hearing from people is like a race to the top, for people who remember that set of ideas from the Obama era in housing reform. So basically, a kind of pay for success, prize, grant program, where if you can demonstrate X, you can get the money. And there's
right.
sort of like you create this kind of escalating effort. Maybe that'll be really successful. You can do other things too, like tying transportation funding to different kinds of zoning reform. I'm not super, at this moment, I'm not super optimistic about any of that. It's not clear to me that either the federal government sort of knows what the levers are to pull, again, this is what I was sort of saying at the beginning, or is willing to do something of such kind of violence to its own coalition or its own relationship with localities or whatever, that it would really shift things. I would like to be proven wrong on that. I'm sure there are ideas, right? Look, you can do a lot by tying all transportation funding to X. What I see them do is create a small program in the DOT to tie a certain amount of transportation funding, which is not that much, to sort of zoning reform imprecisely defined. So I think that the politics of this are not there at the national. We're definitely not talking about population.
We are going to in a second, though.
No. So I think the federal level is, I'm not yet convinced they have a policy recipe that is interesting. But that is also why I think that there is like a real question of defining which things people think were successful here. So there actually is a policy agenda for them to pick up, because that's how a lot of federal legislation works, right? You look around the states, you look at what worked in X state, and you pick up what worked in X state. And so being really clear on this worked and this and here's why is meaningful. So I heard what you're saying about Philadelphia and there being a glut. Some of this stuff I know also has like a lot to do with like local just conditions and who's moving where.
Or national conditions. I mean,
and the interest rates have been a big part of this. Like I recognize that. But so that's like one of my questions as I'm sort of looking into this. What should be the top 3 I'd actually be curious to hear your answer to this. Like, if there are going to be 3 bullet points on the Kamala Harris plan that would like make you, sing a song in the morning, what would they be?
Oh man, I think that low-income folks should be added to the list of protected classes in the FHA. That would do a lot for us. That would be very exciting, and it's an idea. Richard Collenberg has been promoting it. He's at the PPI.
What would that do?
So what that would do, so as it is now, people are constantly asking us, they're like, zoning obviously discriminates against low-income people, right? Because that's what a lot of exclusionary zoning is about, is economic segregation. So can't you like sue a city for zoning out low-income people? And there's this notion of disparate impact, which doesn't really work that well. And you have to show that a city has like nothing really affordable for low-income people, that it's a very high-income place, and you have to show that a protected class like people of color or disabled people with disabilities are disproportionately low income, and so therefore discriminating against low-income people is discriminating against the protected class. But it's like a long road around, and it doesn't really work that well. Adding low-income people directly to the list of protected classes would really open up the situations and places that we could do this, because there are some places that are actually pretty homogenous racially, right? It's if you're in like a relatively rural place, it's the low-income people are also going to be white. It doesn't do anything for you, and it's a much simpler thing anyway, and it's much cheaper for an advocacy group like us to not have to do all of this like sociological research to bring. And okay, specifically how it would work. So picture this: you have a town, call it Swarthmore, outside of Philadelphia, and it's very expensive, and it's a high opportunity place, and it's beautiful. There's like no apartments, and I'm not saying there are no apartments in Swarthmore. I'm just saying it's the kind of place that could happen. And you want to say you're a low-income housing developer, and you want a zoning change in order to build your apartment building. It would allow the developer and advocacy group and the judge and the city really to craft a solution that is extremely locally sensitive, so that the city would basically have to change its zoning to allow this thing to go forward. But it's not a way to like blow up all zoning. They might have some things about a setback, or it has to have bay windows, or whatever, that zoning that they could keep. They would just have to change their zoning to allow housing that is affordable to groups of people who can't currently live there, and it would be very sensitive to the local economy and to what's being proposed. But it would actually create some cause of action for us as advocates to force cities to build low-income housing without having to go through a lot of politics.
We're imagining like blank slate federal policy changes. Isn't there a way to make policy that isn't having judges do it?
I don't know.
I don't really want judges running all housing policy.
I do. You're so wrong about that. This is great. No, they're not gonna run all housing policy, but what's good about it is that it's relatively less political. You have to actually be working with, it's not apolitical, because we're still working with a law that was passed, either at the federal level or at the state level. There's nothing stopping state constitutions also for having this kind of protection. So there are instructions, but the implementation is happening in a less political environment.
All right, let's say that the maybe the hopeful Kamala Harris administration reads this book that Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson are writing about abundance. So like, we need to do something on housing, but also we're totally convinced that too much policy making is done through the courts in America. So unfortunately,
they're already convinced of that?
they would if they'll read this book and take this part. Seriously, there's a long section about how this is bad. And so unfortunately, and I'm super sorry about this, Sonja, but I've accidentally convinced them that this is not the way you should do policy in America. Is there maybe something more direct they could do that would get houses built? Like AOC says, make public housing, right? Like, is there something, like, is there a non-bank shot, right? What can they do?
Well, I actually like, the public housing thing I like. The problem with AOC's is it's not revenue neutral. She's setting up another thing that's, that you have to pass now, and then also governments have to decide every year to fund, which is a total, it's self-sabotage, right? You want to set up public housing that funds itself, mixed income public housing. I think that's a great idea because, to your original point, we passed all these laws that allow private, actors to build housing when there's demand, when interest rates are low, when the economy is working well, which the economy doesn't always work well. And one of the reasons that the 2008 crisis has hamstrung our ability to build housing to this day is that during that time period, so many people in that space left, retired early, young people didn't go into it. We came out of it with a huge housing shortage because for years and years, there was no work, for architects or laborers, the whole, bandwidth, the whole, range. So if we had countercyclical spending, people would stay employed, we'd be building housing, all through. So that kind of stuff can be great. We had sort of an attempt in California. I mean, talk about inter-left fights. The people that killed the California version were not like Republicans who hate public housing. It was folks who wanted the public housing to have higher, deeper levels of affordability than was possible if we wanted it to be revenue neutral. And I think if you're going to be passing a public housing program and you have to keep asking the legislature for money, it's just not going to work. So that's a self-own. So I do like that. I think that's good. I mean, this crowd is, I feel like, going to be there are so many little ideas. From Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they can provide a secondary market for construction financing, for apartment buildings, right? These are things that actually are quite meaningful, that it's not going to be any one thing. It's labs of lots of people, picking a lot of little things. Which is, cool. I think it's great. But I want to talk more about you know what I want to talk about? Population.
This
particular card. Yeah. So population, I was amazed to find out that all of this cat eating thing in Springfield was actually a housing problem. That people were pissed because, their population increased by 25%. And so obviously housing costs went up. There were some new housing came online. But it was basically a housing shortage issue. And the Democratic response and the Republican response are completely opposite, right? You have Republican response we know they are going around accusing people of eating cats, but also, they've dug really, really far down into the scarcity mindset, right? J.D. Vance has this quote that Democrats flooded this country with millions of illegal aliens, so citizens had to compete for precious housing. And precious is a really loaded word there. What are things that are precious? Gold and diamonds. Things that exist and there's so much of them. I mean, you can mine more, but we know there's only so much on the whole planet. You can't even make more. And,
diamonds now, actually.
I mean, yeah. Thank God. Forget about it, right?
You can make out of thin air now.
Yeah. Whereas, the Dems are going much more on the abundance side, right? We have more people. It's a great thing. This is interesting. And let's make more housing. Let's, accommodate people. It makes the abundance ideology so urgent, I think, for what we want to save about democracy. But it does make abundance potentially, not bipartisan. Do you feel like that's a problem or a strength?
I don't tell myself fantasies about how the things I believe will, when it comes down to it, be bipartisan. I know that people like this right now because like, it's bipartisan, and I'm like, you just wait. Because I wrote another book a couple of years ago called Why We're Polarized. And that book is the inquiry, what motivated that inquiry was why does every single policy debate I cover have exactly the same structure? Where right at the beginning, I sit in all these rooms full of left and right-wing policy experts who can both come up with a positive sum negotiation to make up a bill that creates a better situation for both of them than the status quo. And then at the end, all the Democrats vote one way and all the Republicans vote another way. And so the more this stuff comes into the center of politics, the more polarized it will get. I mean, and people I know in the YIMBY movement think about this, right? Do you actually want housing abundance to become a major thing Democratic politicians talk about? Because Donald Trump has already shown how Republicans are going to run the other way from that. They're going to say they're trying to take away your precious single-family zoning, right? They're trying to make all those people, be it whoever it is that day, I guess today Haitian immigrants, live right next to you, right? I mean, Trump, I think it is interesting that at the same time that California's politicians can't actually run on what makes like California great because it has this huge housing problem, Texas's politicians also can't run on what's making Texas so great because the National Republican Party has turned against it. And Florida has some of the same problems. They did some good things by not overregulating housing, but now not overregulating housing is becoming liberal coded because I think liberals respond to policy problems by coming to new views, and Republicans have been responding to policy problems by saying Haitian people eat cats. And so there's this is going to polarize, right? The same thing's happening in clean energy. We're seeing this all over the country. We've seen hundreds of localities pass laws against building solar, but we're seeing that the hardcore Republicans in the Texas state legislature have been trying to shut down a lot of the clean energy building, and they've been stopped by businesses making money on clean energy in Texas, but that can always go the other way. There's been fights like this in Georgia too. Georgia has definitely turned that back because Georgia's getting a huge amount of high value manufacturing jobs, which they really like. But this is all going to polarize, right? If it becomes national. That is a hydraulic function of American politics in this era. So there is, I think, a real question about how national you want it to be and how in the public sphere you want it to be. I don't know the answer to that exactly. I would like some of these abundance questions to remain something both sides can sit with. I will say that I think the part of at least the abundance work that some of that Derek and I are doing that I think will stay this way is that it's embarrassing when government is embarrassing. And conservatives like it when government is embarrassing because it makes government look bad. I think liberals should start to like it more in the sense that it helps them ferret out things they need to change. And so one of the things that I don't think is going to go away is bipartisan interest in why it is so expensive to build public restrooms in New York and California and similar places, or why we can't build high-speed rail. And the reasons the two sides have for being interested here are different. But one of the projects I see myself as engaged in is trying to get liberals to not see these things as exceptions you want to explain away, but as signals that something needs to be investigated. And maybe it turns out it is a weird one-off that you could explain away. But more often than I would like, I'm finding that it's not. It's not like California failed to build high-speed rail, but a bunch of other states in the country took that money and did build it. We have high-speed rail? Nowhere. It's not like highways are cheap to create somewhere here. Nowhere. So, that might stay a little bit non-polarized for a minute.
Yeah, well, it's out of our hands whether it goes to the federal level. I mean, the thing is with YIMBYism and the related idea of abundance, it's actually quite attractive and popular, and so it goes up and down, right? I think that we see Kamala Harris and Obama broadcasting these kinds of talking points because they work. Maybe also because Harris is from Oakland. She spent all this time in San Francisco politics and the California politics, so it's like a severe issue there. She's like very aware of it. But it's also, I mean, the rhetoric is kind of great. It's great for Democrats downstream, right? Because it gives them permission to go all in on these YIMBY talking points that they may have liked, but they might not have known whether they were safe or not. You know, it's like a big permission structure, so it's great for that. It's basically just out of our hands. But, you know, I actually kind of think nothing is bipartisan. I mean, and nothing is actually partisan. I actually think everything can become partisan. And what made me realize that was what's happening with abortion. Like, pro-life, pro-choice are like such, for years we were just, you know, pro-life folks are Republicans and pro-choice people are Democrats, and that's all there is. But as soon as it becomes a live issue, Republicans are running away from it, which makes abortion a lot more bipartisan than I anticipated, you know? At the end of the day, we have sort of people in Washington who are signed up for one club or the other, but most people are regular people who know what they think, you know, and that if you have like the point of all of these parties is to make pitches that attract people, right? So I think that housing is essentially bipartisan, right? We all want it. And also certain elements of freedom are bipartisan. You want to feel like you can move somewhere that you want to live that's going to make your life better. So it's really going to be up to the parties to like compete for people's allegiance and their votes.
I think that was optimistic.
I mean, otherwise, like, how does change happen and what are we doing?
Well, I don't know that abundance is a great word. It's like a great word.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's a great word. Everybody likes it.
And then you start filling in the details.
Yeah.
And I guess I would say that I am not of the view that this will all, like, forget being easy, even be popular, right, if you could do it. A lot of it I don't even think is going to be at that level. I mean, one of the things I'm totally convinced by digging into this, and this is why the fact that like everything is playing out, or so many of these things play out locally matters, is that so many of the changes that would be needed here, nobody's ever going to know happened, right? Whether or not we pass the kind of transmission reform we need to pass to build transmission lines at the pace we need to build them, just the number of voters seriously tracking what is happening with FERC is no voters, like 0 voters. And I think a lot of things are like that. I mean, maybe if you got to a really torrid pace of home building in California, like that would shift politics in some way or another. It's not even clear to me that it would. I live in a part of New York, Gowanus, that, so for those who don't know Brooklyn, and I don't know Brooklyn very well, but Brooklyn has these like really fancy neighborhoods, Park Slope and Carroll Gardens, that everybody wants to live in. And then between them, there's a canal filled with poison. It's like a poison canal, and it's a super fun site. And so you have these super beautiful neighborhoods, and then this like poison canal. And around the poison canal is a lot of industrial, or was a lot of industrial usage, and it was zoned industrial. And at some point somebody came along and it's like, well, if we have to build housing somewhere, what if we do it here in like the Superfund site? And Brad Landers, running for governor, and I'm sorry, for mayor, and some other people like came along and did this big upzoning. And now I live in like this like poison canal part of Brooklyn. And when I look around, there are huge buildings going up everywhere. They're bringing online like 8,000, 9,000 units of housing in a matter of like 4 or 5 years. I've never lived anywhere that is actually building housing. And I don't think you could have done it. And I'm like digging into this more. If the reputation Gowanus had wasn't as like an armpit, right? There were people who lived there, but it was considered polluted. It was considered like, it was considered a place that, I mean, it was a place, it was industrial. But now that it's happening, it's like great, and people like it. And one of the, and like people don't just like it, we've moved there. And one of the things I've seen just happen a million times is the most dangerous place for policy is the moment right before passage or right before implementation. Because that is when people can imagine what they're going to lose or how it's going to go wrong. And once it's done, frankly, whether it's good or bad, people tend to make piece with it one way or the other, right? The Affordable Care Act is a great example of this, where it was so controversial, it's going to end the free enterprise system, and then it's like in place, it's like, well, let's not get rid of that. A lot of things work like that. And so there is a sort of valley of death for policy, which is like when you're trying to pass it and people are thinking about it and the interest groups are fighting it, and when you're trying to implement it. And then on the other side, I think a lot can be done. But so a lot is about just like, how do you get through that part? And some things are popular and you can sort of fight that out in public. And some things are technocratic and you can try to pass laws around them. And some things are judicial and you're sort of doing that like behind everybody's back. But everything has like a different strategy, I think. But you're just like trying to get to the right answer. Because I'm doing this work, I get like all these interest groups now coming to me and be like, hey man, you want some polling? Like, is there something you want us to poll? Because we pay pollsters for things. And I was like, no, like I don't care if it's popular. It's not my job. And it's like the politician's job, but most of this stuff, or a lot of it, nobody's gonna know is happening. Like you have to get to a good outcome, then run on the good outcome, right? Brad Lander is running for mayor on what he did in Gowanus. Like you can run on success, but it's sort of hard to promise it.
So we only have like 15 minutes, but I guess my question now is, how do you implement implementation? Like what is it that you think people are supposed to do? And who's your audience really?
Hi, and to you guys on the Zoom. I'm working with Derek right now on the conclusion of the book, and we've sort of been going back and forth on this question of agenda. Do you want to put in all these this policy and that policy, and without ruining the end of this thrilling story we're telling? I think the answer is no. Like one of the views I have is
Wait, the answer was no?
Yeah.
The answer to my question of what are people supposed to do was no?
No. The answer to my question
sorry.
of should I have a lot of bullet points at the end
right.
of my book
Yeah,
was
no, you shouldn't. I agree with that.
Because you're working, I think, right now at the level of ideology. You're working at the level of ideas. You ever see, there's a video that kind of goes around or gets written up in like all the pop social science books, but you may have seen it. It's like a video, it's like a bunch of people playing basketball, and they're like passing the ball back and forth and passing the ball back and forth. And then you watch, you're like, that was a good video of people playing basketball. And then it's like, hey, idiot, there was a giant person in a gorilla costume who just walked through this video. And I was like, they rewind it, and sure enough, you were watching the ball, and like some dude in a gorilla suit just walked through the center of that video, and you never saw them. And I think politics is sort of like that. You notice the problems you know how to look for. So a good example is over the past couple of years, one thing liberals began thinking a lot about, sometimes I think in smart ways, sometimes in ways that now look less effective, but was equity, right? They began to get asked and consider this question of the question of equity. And like when I look at that, right, like yes to more neighbors, like yes to like diverse neighborhoods, right? People began looking for that question and that problem and then coming up with a lot of ways to address it. Some of them worked, some of them didn't, some of them we'd like to go further. Politics is a sort of unending series of like being taught to see a different problem. And like my kind of view about liberals and liberalism, myself included, is for a long time we were taught to ask a question, where is there something people can't afford? And like people and we still, right, like a lot of liberals and things just kind of hunting around for that question. Childcare, okay, maybe we can give people childcare tax credits. Health insurance, we can give people health insurance tax credits. Like food, we can give them food stamps, we can give them SNAP, right? You can kind of go down this list. I think that the sort of like perceptual change that we're trying to effectuate in liberalism is to look around and say, where don't people have enough of a thing they need? Mm-hmm. And once you ask that question, then you have the second set of questions, why? And the whys are going to be different. They're going to be different for different things. They're going to be different in different places. They're going to be different at different levels of government. And it's about sort of getting a generation of people who are going to be in all these different jobs to be looking for that question, right? To be looking for that, is enough happening question. My understanding is the honored sponsors of tonight, the American Planning Association, have been in a project of trying to get their planners to think more about this question. Why are we not building houses fast enough? The Housing Accelerator Fund or project is the project of the last couple of years. It's not been around for 50 years. People, the great work of the YIMBYs, I think, has been to get people to look around at housing and think not that people can't afford it, but that there isn't enough of it, and that's why they can't afford it, right? And that is just going to be a thing that I think liberalism in this generation, and God willing conservatism too. There are people who've been sort of working a similar argument in conservatism, I think with frankly less success. But I wish Tyler Cowen and state capacity libertarianism and the Niskanen Institute and Jim Pethokoukis and conservative futurism all the good. I hope they all succeed. But you got to sort of start looking at something different, and then people are going to have to, in a million different ways, figure out how to implement that, because there's no one way.
So whatever it is in your power to do with all your might, is something you might say.
Yes, I guess so. Is that your thing?
That's from Ecclesiastes, because Sukkot is coming, so I was reading it.
Yeah, sure.
But no, that is it, actually, and I'm glad. Your audience is the people here. It is the people watching, whoever's watching. Whatever it is you're doing in your job, you have an opportunity with the right lens being let's actually make this thing happen. Let's not find ways to mess it up, and let's try to make more. Do that. You're the expert on how you can get that done, whatever your role is. So that's your mission for this year. And join your local YIMBY chapter, because you'll meet other people who want to do that too. Stand up and shake hands? Is that how you end these things?
Yeah, you can do it that way. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
What are 3 books you recommend to the audience?
Everybody wanted me to nail you. All right, you're still on mic. You can answer that.
Sure.
Yeah, okay, encore. Somebody said encore. So yeah, what are the 3 books you recommend?
I'm trying to think if I'm going to do it specifically for this audience. I guess so, right? People here who haven't read Howard Fischel's Zoning Rules should. Connor Doherty's Golden Gates is a great history.
It's a great one. It's one of the best.
Of the YIMBY movement. It's another book that people should read. David Potter's People of Plenty. It's good. For people who are thinking about this, reaching back and seeing some of these earlier threads in American history, that book was a revelation to me and helped me frame a lot of what I'm thinking for my book. So David Potter's People of Plenty, you can find it in sort of weird used book, purveyors. But it's great, it's short, it's interesting.
Cool, thank you.
All right, thanks everybody.